Welcome back to the illumilands podcast. My name is Daniel Hurd, and I'm very appreciative you've decided to give this episode a listen. In the last episode, I began expanding upon my Kalam overview video from a few years ago. Specifically, I went over the support for and objections to premise 1. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. In this episode, I move to the support for and objections to premise 2. The universe began to exist. So, without further ado, let's get into it. Here is my older presentation of premise 2. The defense for the second premise, that the universe began to exist, is to argue that it's impossible for the series of past events in the universe to be infinite. In other words, the past must be finite. In arguing for this, a distinction is made between a potential infinity and an actual infinity. A potential infinity is a set that is constantly increasing towards infinity but never reaches it. For example, imagine a number that's constantly added to by 1. You can just keep adding 1 to it forever and ever and ever, and it'll keep getting bigger and bigger. There's no limit to how big it can get. But it will never actually reach infinity. It'll only ever be a bigger finite number. On the other hand, an actual infinity is a set or collection of things which consists of an infinite number of members. It's not constantly getting bigger or smaller. It just exists, and the number of elements it has in it is equal to infinity. An example of this would be the set of all natural numbers. If the past were infinite, it would have to be an actual infinity, not a potential infinity. Now, why is this? Well, it's because the past has already happened. All those events have already been actualized. So, if the past is infinite, then it has to be an actual infinity. So, William Lane Craig, a big proponent of the Kalam, and basically the reason the Kalam Cosmological Argument is a popular argument today, has formulated 2 sub-arguments to justify premise 2. Here is the first sub-argument. Premise 1. An actual infinite cannot exist. Premise 2. An infinite temporal regress of events is an actual infinite, and the conclusion, therefore, an infinite temporal regress of events cannot exist. Now, this argument is obviously logically valid. That is, if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. Now, this may seem odd, but I'm actually not going to go over premise 1 of this sub-argument in this episode. The possibility of actual infinities existing is a fascinating subject matter, but it's also one that can get extremely complicated, and it's technically not even required for the Kalam to be a sound argument. So I'm going to save it for another episode. For this episode, I will simply skip past premise 1 and proceed letting you know that it's a very contentious issue. With that said, let's evaluate premise 2 of this sub-argument. An infinite temporal regress of events is an actual infinite. In defense of this premise, William Lane Craig has said, quote, "In a beginningless series of past events of equal duration, the number of past events must be infinite, for it is larger than any natural number." Graham Oppy, an outspoken critic of the Kalam, agrees with this. Quote, "This seems right. An infinite number of events stretching back into the past would form an actually infinite set, as would an infinite number of events stretching into the future." Unquote. I have to agree with them. But what reasons are there for rejecting premise 2? Two related objections have been raised. The first claims that the set of past events in a past eternal universe is not actually infinite. That's the first. The second claims that the set of past events in a past eternal universe is actually infinite, but it's not an example of an existing actual infinite, and thus the argument as a whole is irrelevant. Or I should say this sub-argument as a whole is irrelevant. Now, I recognize, especially the second objection that I listed, that was very wordy, so you are more than forgiven if you feel like you want to go back and re-listen to that, because it was kind of a mouthful. But getting on to the first claim, Aristotle and his followers suggested that an eternal past is not an actual infinite. Now, at first, this is a bit odd. What type of infinity would an eternal past be if not an actual infinite? According to Aristotle, an infinite past is only an example of a potential infinity. The past doesn't exist. Neither does the future. All that truly exists, says Aristotle, is the present. As such, there is no actually existing set of past events. There's no existing thing to be actually infinite. The only sense in which the past exists is as the process where present moments give rise to new present moments. This process can continue indefinitely, making the past a potential infinite in this sense. Really, I think a better way of putting it is that it makes time a potential infinite in this sense. So, Craig has responded by reminding us in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology that, quote, the non-existence of things is no hindrance to their being enumerated. That is, even if something is non-existent, we can still number its members or its parts. There is a definite number of past U.S. presidents, a definite number of businesses closed in 1950, and a definite number of days between the beginning of this year and yesterday. Similarly, just because past events are no longer real, that doesn't mean it's impossible to quantify or count how many past events there have been. Quote, any obstacle to counting non-existent things is merely epistemic. That is to say, it's merely a limitation of our own psychology. Thus, there is a definite number of past events. If the universe is eternal, that number must be greater than any natural number. That is, an eternal universe must be actually infinite. Craig's reasoning here is correct. The number of events in an eternal universe is actually infinite. And so the first objection that would say that an eternal universe is not an actual infinite, I think we can see that that is clearly wrong-headed. Obviously, the number of events in an eternal universe is actually infinite. But, even though that's the first objection dealt with, we still have the second objection, and this objection, at least in my opinion, is much stronger, or at least much more complicated, maybe, than the first objection. But some would say Dr. Craig's response doesn't actually address Aristotle's crucial point. This is the second objection. The relevant point is not that past things cannot be counted, or that the set of events in an eternal universe isn't actually infinite. It's not that. Rather, the point is that in an eternal universe, there is no time at which an actual infinite exists, because the past doesn't exist. Even if the number of past events is actually infinite, those events don't exist. True, they did exist, and Craig is right that our ability to count the number of past events, despite the past in no way existing, is analogous to our ability to count the number of past presidents or businesses closed. But this doesn't clearly help his case here. Non-existent things can be counted, but by the same token, countable things, like past events, can be non-existent. I'll repeat that. Non-existent things can be counted, but by the same token, countable things, like past events, can be non-existent. Craig agrees that the set of all natural numbers is actually infinite, but he would deny that any such infinity could be, quote, instantiated in the world of the real, unquote. I kind of find that quote amusing, because it's like he could just say the real world, but no, it's instantiated in the world of the real. All right. Dr. Craig also accepts a dynamic view of time. That is, the past no longer exists, and the future does not yet exist. But if the past truly is non-existent, right? If it's non-existent, it doesn't exist, then an eternal universe is compatible with the non-existence of all actual infinities. Although the number of past events is actually infinite, nothing actually infinite exists. And if that seems confusing to you, you're certainly not alone. Again, it's weird to think that something with an eternal past, still isn't an example of an actual infinity. But, I mean, this objection, even though something seems kind of weird about it, it's not immediately a bad objection. I mean, in philosophy, I think this would be and has been taken as at least a semi-serious criticism of the Kalam. Premise 2 is correct that an eternal universe is an actual infinity, similar to numbers. But because past events are non-existent, the set of past events, though infinite, does not describe any existing actual infinity. Only a static view of time that sees all moments existing all together, so to speak, one big chunk, the space-time block universe. Only on that view would an infinite past entail the existence of an actual infinity. In that case, it has to be an existing actual infinity, because all the moments still exist, and we still claim that they exist. That's on a static view. And really, as I think this all through, it occurs to me that this objection is less about premise 2 and more about the irrelevance of the whole sub-argument to the Kalam. This whole argument that actual infinities can't exist, an eternal universe is an actual infinite, so an eternal universe can't exist. We can thus say that Craig has successfully defended premise 2. But only in a technical sense. Premise 2 says that an eternal universe is an actual infinity. And this is true if by an eternal universe we mean a universe whose set of past events is infinite. In that sense, an eternal universe is an actual infinity. That seems uncontroversial to me. I would be very surprised to find somebody disagreeing with that. But, I mean, if you do, leave a comment. That'd be nice to see. Yes, so premise 2 is technically defended pretty well by Dr. Craig, but a new problem, just as threatening to the argument, arises. So let's say that we grant the entire argument and we get to the conclusion. Therefore, an infinite temporal regress of events cannot exist, says the Kalam's proponent. But the objector replies, great! At no time in an eternal universe does there exist an actual infinity of events. Another way to frame this objection is as follows. Craig has stated that something exists if it is instantiated in the mind-independent world of the real. Assuming presentism, the present moment is the only thing that exists. Thus, past events do not exist. It makes no difference to the Kalam how many events have passed, finite or infinite, because that number only describes the quantity of a set containing solely non-existent members, like the set of natural numbers, something that Dr. Craig does not believe exists in the mind-independent world of the real. And this sub-argument is strictly about the existence of actual infinities, a case in which something exists that has an infinite number of parts. If past events don't exist, how could they possibly count as parts of this universe? You can't have non-existent parts. That doesn't make any sense. Something's having an actually infinite past is compatible with the non-existence of all actual infinities. That is the core of this objection. I'll repeat it. Something's having an actually infinite past is compatible with the non-existence of all actual infinities. Alexander Pruss, a theistic philosopher, agrees that, quote, given presentism, finitism, the view that there can only be finitely many things, is compatible with infinite sequences of causes, as long as at no particular time are there infinitely many causes. So there's this difference here between an actual infinity that exists at a time and, in a sense, an actual infinity of times or events. To some, this objection appears to completely fizzle out any force the sub-argument was meant to provide. Even granting the non-existence of all actual infinities, we can grant both premises, and yet the sub-argument is still irrelevant because, yeah, eternal universes can't exist. Like, if presentism is true, an eternal universe in the sense of a universe where all events exist, so that would form an existing actual infinite, that is not what an eternal universe would be like, unless it was some kind of static universe where all events exist at once. If it's the case that this objection is good, then all the debates over infinity related to the Kalam have really been a bit pointless. I shouldn't say all of the debates over infinity. There is still the second sub-argument, and that deals with infinity. But at least it renders this sub-argument not very powerful. That said, others may view this objection as a mere game of semantics. This is all just wordplay. Even if the past doesn't now exist, which is an absurdity when you think about it, the past now existing, even if the past doesn't exist, a universe which undergoes an actually infinite number of events surely counts as something actually infinite. This is why I brought up before. It's just flat out weird and maybe even wrong to think that the statement, there is an eternal universe, could be true, but that the statement, an eternal universe exists, is not true. Because grammatically, and in just standard English, those two sentences mean the same thing. Unless, like Kant pointed out, unless existence is taken as a property, or what he called a predicate of something. If existence is a property, that is, if there are things, some of which have the property existing and some of which have the property not existing, then there would truly be a difference between there being an eternal universe and there... No, you couldn't even do that. I'm refuting myself mid-podcast. Oh, man. Yeah, well, either way, just know that this objection, even though it is a serious objection and it does need to be dealt with by the proponent of the Kalam, despite this, there are, I think, pretty good, if not conclusive, reasons to think that this objection actually fails as well. So, what do you think about all of this? Does this objection to the Kalam succeed? Or is there something off about it? Let me know what you think in the comments. I wanted this episode to set up the objection as strongly as possible, so that I can have a nice dichotomy between this episode, which is in support of the objection, and the next episode, which is going to be reasons why this objection might not be such a good objection. So, thank you all very much for listening. I appreciate it a heck of a lot, more than you know. Just so you guys are aware, I am actually in the process of setting up a Patreon with certain rewards for those who feel like donating a bit to help the channel out. It's definitely kind of difficult doing all the research and work necessary to get these videos out while also working a full-time job, and a fairly exhausting full-time job at that. But I don't have that Patreon set up quite yet, so tune in a later episode where I'll probably announce that it's up. So, thank you very much for watching again. I'll see you in the next one.